In Hitler's Germany, the Third Reich was putting on a grand parade. At the Day of German Art in Munich. The past was being rewritten to suit the tenets of Nazism, and the Nazis were predicting the future as 1,000 years of history under the swastika. That was the way Adolf Hitler saw it. He believed that he was destined to forge a greater German Reich. He was obsessed with the struggle for racial supremacy and Lebensraum for the German people. Victory or doom was the cornerstone of his ideology. After France was ignominiously defeated, Hitler attained the peak of his power. Before 1914, he had been a homeless drifter in Vienna. In 1940, he ruled the continent. But the Führer was still not satisfied. His goal was to extend the Reich all the way to the Ural Mountains. This, however, was the end of the illusion. Berlin in April 1945. Hitler's ideological crusade was lost. Germany and large parts of Europe lay in ruins. But the dictator had one final objective in mind, a death wish, to drag the entire nation along with him into the abyss. Soviet troops had been attacking the outskirts of Berlin since the 21st of April. Stalin had given them orders to take the capital by the 1st of May, to bring the war against his archenemy to a triumphant conclusion by May Day. The civilian population was crushed between the lines. The sole obstacle left between them and an end to the carnage was Hitler himself.
I think that very few people towards the end of the war were still fanatical supporters of Hitler. Perhaps 10% of the population, the guess. But of course amongst them then the most powerful in the land. And for the rest, there were various forms, I think, of behavior or attitude, but in general, people were resigned, I think, largely apathetic, just waiting for the end of the war, and if they thought about Hitler at all, then it was as a hindrance to the end of the war.
The Red Army had encircled the frontline city of Berlin with over 1 million troops. At the center of the capital, near the Reichstag and the Brandenburg Gate, was the new Chancellery, completed in 1939 and intended to be a symbol of the overarching power and glory of the Third Reich. Hitler returned to Berlin on the 18th of January. By then, the Reich Chancellery was deserted. It had been badly damaged by Allied bombers. Following the disastrous winter campaign against the Soviet Union that had ended outside Moscow in late 1941, Hitler had ordered Albert Speer's office to build a complex of underground air raid shelters in the garden of the new Chancellery. This catacomb was divided into two sections, the ante-bunker and the so-called Führer bunker. In the upper part on the right-hand side was the staff accommodation. Below, almost 10 meters beneath the surface, was the Führer bunker, which had 20 small, sparsely furnished rooms. Hitler's living room and study, his bedroom, and Eva Braun's bedroom. SS guard Rochus Misch was Hitler's bodyguard and telephone operator.
Solange Besprechungen waren, nicht, da war da im Bunker.
As long as there were briefings, there was life in the bunker. But when the briefing stopped, it was like a concrete coffin.
Ein toter Betonsarg.
Seeking shelter from the constant air raids, Hitler had gone underground with his closest aides in mid-February. The rooms were small and plainly furnished. The bunker had not been intended as the Reich's command center. There was a central hallway, with the engine room off to the right and also the radio room. This led to the antechamber of the briefing room and the briefing room itself. In the last 10 days of his life, Hitler did not put a foot outside the bunker. There are several conflicting reports of what really happened inside the shelter. File number 462 contains a report on Hitler and his surroundings, written by the Soviet Secret Service. This spectacular find in the Russian State Archives for Contemporary History provides new insights into Hitler's final days. The sources of the report were two prisoners: SS Major Otto Guncher, Hitler's aide-de-camp since February 1944, and Heinz Linger, Hitler's manservant since 1939, seen here on his return from Soviet captivity in 1955. This work, the Book of Hitler, of which there was only one copy made, was specially written for his nemesis, Joseph Stalin.
Das Besondere am Buch Hitler ist zum einen, dass es viele neue Umstände aus dem...
What is special about the Book of Hitler is, on the one hand, that it shows many new circumstances from Hitler's personal surroundings, and what is particularly interesting is how he dealt with the generals. This controversy between Hitler and his own military. It also shows that Hitler was much more personally involved in the persecution of the Jews than previous historiography has shown. According to these documents, Hitler was presented with two proposals for the gas chambers in 1942. He gave his blessing and then ordered all available support to be provided to the engineers in charge of the project. The Book of Hitler actually shows Hitler as a completely broken man. It is evident that in those final days, he was just scraping along, devoid of any energy or drive. He would play with his dog for hours, seemingly absent-minded and completely unable to make any decisions, least of all, how to end it all.
On the 7th of March, Hitler paid a final visit to his troops on the front line. At the 9th Army headquarters on the River Oder, the dictator, who had clearly lost his grip on reality and was visibly ravaged by decay, demanded that his troops fight to their dying breath. No one argued with him.
Es ging auch in seinem kranken Zustand.
As sick as he was, he still had this aura about him. And this effect was enhanced by a sort of madness. I don't mean that he was foaming from his mouth or started to chew the carpet, as people used to say. These were all mere legends. But there was this exaggerated identification with the German nation. He was convinced that with his own death and with the death of his ideology, the German people did not have a chance to survive.
Für das deutsche Volk keine Überlebensmöglichkeit mehr wäre.
The very last film footage of Hitler shows him in the Chancellery Garden on the 20th of March, decorating boys of the Hitler Youth for bravery.
Und wenn man diese beiden Dinge nun verbindet,
if you combine these two aspects, his pathological arrogance on the one hand, and the almost indescribable, overwhelming effect that he had on people on the other hand, you might begin to understand why so many people followed him up to the very end.
Warum so viele Menschen ihm bis zum Schluss gefolgt waren.
The 20th of April was Hitler's birthday. For one final time, Goebbels praised the dictator in a fanatical eulogy.
Das deutsche Volk hat ihn geboren. Es hat ihn auf den Schild erhoben. Es hat ihn sich in freier Wahl zum Führer erkoren. Ein Mann von wahrhaft säkularer Größe, von einem Mut ohnegleichen, von einer Standhaftigkeit, die Herzen erhebt und erschüttert.
The high echelons of the Nazi state gathered once more in the Reich Chancellery to celebrate their Führer's 56th birthday. Many of them urged Hitler to leave Berlin. but he wanted to stay, to die where he stood, and turn his death into a glorious spectacle. These images of the bunker were shot in 1987, shortly before it was demolished. This was the stage for the final act of the tragedy. After the celebration was over, most of the Nazi leaders fled from Berlin as fast as they could. Only a few of his most loyal followers remained with him in the bunker, as well as some members of his personal staff, such as his secretary, Traudl Junge.
Ja, das war eigentlich erst an Hitlers Geburtstag, an seinem letzten Geburtstag.
Well, it was actually on Hitler's last birthday, on the 20th of April, that the situation became so critical that for the first time we thought we might be defeated and that we might be trapped here in Berlin.
Soviet shells began to fall on the government buildings in the administrative district of the city. Hitler was woken by his manservant, Heinz Linger, on the 21st of April at 9:30 in the morning. He wanted to know where the gunfire was coming from. Were the Russians that close already? The explosions could be heard clearly, even in the private quarters in the lower part of the bunker. Hitler knew then that the end was close. His overriding concern at that point was his place in history.
He thought, if he staged this disaster with pomp and circumstance, he would secure an afterlife for himself in legend and folklore. He would not have been a complete failure. He was filled with a whole range of very complex emotions, but they gave him some kind of satisfaction, even at a time when everything was lost.
He dreamed of a theatrical finale, enacted with magnificent spectacle in the manner of a Wagnerian opera, just like the Nazi Party annual conventions. When the curtain fell, he should be standing center stage, his friend the architect Albert Speer once advised him.
Den Befehl gab uns kein irdischer Vorgesetzter, den gab uns der Gott, der unser Volk geschaffen hat.
As late as February 1945, Hitler was reminiscing fondly over his model of the Austrian city of Linz, which he had with him in the bunker of the Chancellery. This was the place where he wanted to be buried, in a sarcophagus, high above the city, as if on an altar.
On top of it all, he had this sense for drama, and the greatest drama, that much he had learned from Wagner, always ended with Götterdämmerung, the twilight of the gods, the end of the world. And in this sense, I venture to say he might have considered his end in Berlin more fitting for himself than, well, what would he have done with a victory? March into New Delhi? Invade Nepal? That was not his place. No, the end suited him. It was the logical consequence of everything he'd ever thought, felt, and wished for.
The 22nd of April, 3:30 in the afternoon, a briefing in the bunker. Outside, Soviet troops had already penetrated the inner line of defense around Berlin. They were now only 12 kilometers away from the Reich Chancellery. Major Bernd Freytag von Loringhoven, an aide-de-camp, witnessed the crisis meeting from its beginning.
Die Lage war also katastrophal. Daraufhin hat plötzlich abrupt
The situation was disastrous. All of a sudden, and this had never happened before, Hitler sent out all the aides and ordered only Keitel, Jodl, Krebs and Bormann to stay with him.
Keitel, Jodl, Krebs und Bormann.
These were Hitler's closest confidants in the bunker. Martin Bormann, his secretary. Wilhelm Keitel, head of the Wehrmacht Supreme Command. Alfred Jodl, Chief of Staff at the Wehrmacht Supreme Command. Hitler believed an armored corps under SS Lieutenant General Felix Steiner would be able to repel the Soviet advance. but this core existed only in his imagination. When news reached the bunker that Steiner's assault would never take place, Hitler reacted like a raving madman.
Dass Hitler zum ersten Mal zusammengebrochen ist dabei. Hat also den Krieg zum ersten Mal.
That Hitler had caved in for the first time during that meeting. For the first time, he considered the war lost. Krebs told me Hitler had actually cried, but he switched right back into attack mode. It all happened because nobody trusted me, nobody believed in me, and most of all, because the army generals let me down.
Dass man nicht an mich geglaubt hat, und vor allen Dingen ist es die Generalität des Heeres gewesen, die also mich im Stich gelassen hat.
The fit of rage ended in a flood of self-pity. The war was lost, Hitler lamented. But he was not going to leave Berlin. He would rather shoot himself. Hitler suspected treason everywhere. He even felt that the fanatically loyal SS had betrayed him, and that the troops were not fighting bravely enough, and that all their generals were without honor. The situation was utterly hopeless, and yet he would not put an end to the war. None of the generals inside the bunker made any objection to the senseless continuation of the bloodshed.
Nobody said a word. Instead, they all ran after Hitler, who was groping his way along the walls of the briefing room with great difficulty. And they said, "You wouldn't want to give up now, my Führer. Victory is at hand." What they told him was, of course, utter nonsense. It only revealed their cowardice and their submissiveness. But it also showed how impressed they were by the great performance that Hitler had staged.
Weil sie alle beeindruckt waren von dem großen Auftritt, den Hitler da inszeniert hat.
Melodramatic contradiction was an essential part of his role-playing. Hitler had just foretold the end of the struggle. Then, in the next minute, he predicted the Russians would suffer their bloodiest defeat ever at the gates of Berlin.
I believe that this tantrum on the 22nd of April was the turning point at which he personally realized and accepted for himself that the end was near.
"It is over, gentlemen," Hitler said. "I will stay in Berlin and shoot myself when the time comes. Whoever wishes to leave is free to do so." With each day, each hour that passed, Soviet troops got closer to the bunker, but there was still a chance of escape. Hitler wanted all the women in the bunker, Eva Braun and his secretaries, to be taken to a safe place, his mountain retreat near Berchtesgaden. But Eva Braun had dedicated her whole life to Adolf Hitler. She had been the dictator's mistress since 1936. The general public knew nothing about her. As a consort, she had had to keep the lowest of low profiles throughout their relationship. On the 7th of March 1945, she had left Berchtesgaden and joined Hitler in Berlin as a pledge of her loyalty. This was her bedroom in the bunker.
Und dann hat die Eva Braun gesagt,
and then Eva Braun told him, "You know I'm going to stay with you." And then he walked over to her and he gave her a kiss, which he had never, ever done in front of witnesses. And so the three of us, the secretaries, decided to stay as well.
In those last days, Hitler was obsessed by the notion that Germany had to keep on fighting. He desperately needed the end of the Second World War to be different from the end of the First in 1918, which had traumatized him all his life.
In the last period, Hitler's chief concern, and it had been a concern of his throughout, was there would be no repeat of 1918. It had been after all, one of the driving forces of his so-called career. No repeat of 1918, absolutely ruled out, and that he would demonstrate that he had stuck it out to the end, fought against the odds. Of course, part of this myth also, betrayed on all sides, let down on all sides, he alone had heroically held out, heroically alone supported by his few faithful people when everybody else was abandoning him, and that this was the image which was to be conveyed to the future generation.
As early as March, Hitler had ordered the supplies and foodstuffs of the nation to be destroyed to prevent the Russians from seizing them. The man in the bunker did not want to hear about the mass murder of Jews, the suffering of ordinary Germans, the expulsion and displacement of millions of European men and women. In the end, Hitler regarded the German people as nothing but
a nation of losers. If the German people are going to lose the war, it will have shown itself as the weaker one, and I will not shed a tear for it. That was 19th century social Darwinism. The weak ones are destroyed, and they deserve to be, and so the Germans deserve to be destroyed.
Hitler wanted to elevate a humiliating military defeat into a heroic catastrophe. This is the final photograph of him, taken in the ruins of the Chancellery. Joseph Goebbels and his wife Magda shared Hitler's ideas about destiny, the twilight of the gods, and the fight to the very end. On the 22nd of April, the Goebbels family, Joseph, Magda, and their 6 children, moved into the bunker.
Sag mal schnell, lieber Papa. Lauter.
Papa! Maikäfer fliegt, dein Vater ist im Krieg, deine Mutter ist in Sommerland, abgebrannt, Maikäfer fliegt. Das aus, das Lied.
Magda Goebbels was willing to sacrifice her life for the dogma of National Socialism, and she intended to take her children with her. They stayed in the upper section of the bunker. Each child was allowed only one toy and some night clothes. They were told that was all they would need.
And
that brought fresh life into the bunker. The kids were free and open, and they found it interesting to be with Uncle Adolf.
Die fanden das eigentlich ein sehr schönes Abenteuer.
Bad news arrived with increasing urgency. The 23rd of April, Soviet troops were moving closer with each advancing hour and had already reached the suburb of Tegel. And then the little community in the bunker was shaken by a telex from Berchtesgaden. It was sent by Hermann Göring, who had been Hitler's second-in-command since 1939. He wanted to hear a sign of life from the Führer by 2200 hours, or else he would proclaim himself his successor. Hitler's secretary Martin Bormann saw a chance to get rid of Göring, his arch-adversary. Again the word treason was whispered. Hitler was furious and immediately relieved Göring of his command. On the 25th of April, the noose around Berlin tightened. Heavy fighting raged in the streets of the eastern and southern suburbs of the city. The remnants of the Wehrmacht were scattered in disarray.
Innerlich hatten wir aufgegeben, nicht?
We had given up in our minds, but we were not allowed to surrender as long as the commander-in-chief was telling us to keep fighting in an irrational hope for victory.
Es besteht auch immer eine irreale Hoffnung.
German troops were still putting up a spirited but hopeless show of resistance outside Berlin. Hitler's last hope was the 12th Army under General Walter Wenck, which was supposed to stop the Americans at the River Elbe, but was then ordered to do the impossible. Wenck received orders to liberate the capital. Field Marshal Keitel drove to the front line to relay the order to Wenck directly. Liberate Berlin and get the Führer out. It was all up to Wenck now to save Germany, Keitel told him.
Wir haben überlegt, was kann man jetzt machen?
We thought, what could we do now? We certainly would not attack Berlin. Berlin was a juggernaut, and we most certainly were not going to send our soldiers in there to be slaughtered. All I know is that Hitler was hoping for Wenck's army to get him out of there. And Keitel told us, "You have to get the Führer out." And Wenck replied, "We'll do what we can."
Und der Wenck hat immer gesagt, wir werden machen, was wir können.
Wenck's army actually started to move towards Berlin, not in order to rescue the city, but to pick up thousands of wounded soldiers. In the briefing room of the bunker, however, the mood was almost euphoric when this latest news arrived from an area southwest of Berlin.
Die Armee Wenck hat Ferch erreicht.
Wenck's army had reached Ferch. Hitler reached for the map, looked at it, and turned towards Krebs, as if he wanted to say, "Maybe we can make it after all." Krebs adjusted his monocle and said, "My Führer, Ferch is not Berlin."
Mein Führer, Ferch ist noch nicht Berlin.
A last-minute rescue, just the way it had happened to Frederick the Great, King of Prussia, back in 1762. Craving a miracle, Hitler kept looking up at the portrait of Frederick the Great he kept on the wall of his study.
There was still a loss of reality, or at least a clutching at straws, the hope that something would turn up. So whenever there was a glimmer of the slightest bit of good news, Hitler clutched to it like a drowning man clutches at straws and was hoping for the best, until that too turned out to be unreal.
The 26th of April, 7 o'clock in the morning. A fine dust crept into the bunker through the ventilation system. The artillery shells were falling very close now. The Soviet artillery was firing a barrage directly at the government buildings, but inside the bunker, nobody knew exactly where the Red Army soldiers were. Radio contact to the outside world had been interrupted, so telephone numbers were dialed at random to ask anyone who picked up the phone where the Soviet troops were. This was the only way for those inside the bunker to find out how much time they had left. Then a guard came rushing in, shouting, "The Russians are firing at the entrance with machine guns." Panic-stricken, he ran through the hallways and looked at all the listless faces. They just gazed back at him. It turned out to be a false alarm, a final, fleeting reprieve. At 9 o'clock in the evening, on the 28th of April, the German language service of the BBC announced,
Himmler hat nach einer Meldung Großbritannien und der Vereinigten Staaten, nicht aber der Sowjetunion bedingungslose Kapitulation angeboten.
No other news affected Hitler as deeply as this act of treachery supposedly committed by his loyal Heinrich, the head of the SS. Hermann Fegelein was Himmler's liaison officer inside the bunker. Fegelein was a career criminal. As the commander of an SS cavalry brigade, he had been responsible for the slaughter of more than 10,000 Russian civilians in the Pripyat marshes in 1941. He didn't stay at the front for long. His ambition was to penetrate the heart of Nazi power. In September 1943, he arrived at the Führer's headquarters as liaison officer for the SS.
Und dann war das so ein Naturbursch-Typ.
There was this rough, tough braggart, a swaggerer, but charming in his own way. Both men and women liked that. I think he might not have been very popular with his colleagues, but the ladies loved him.
War sicherlich ein echter Ladykiller.
He was a real lady killer, and he tried his charm on anyone under 80. He told me I was a neuter to him because I resisted, but I guess he would have tried.
On the 3rd of June 1944, Fegelein achieved his goal. He married Gretel Braun, Eva's sister, which promoted him to being something like Hitler's brother-in-law. Bormann and Himmler were the witnesses. Eva wanted her sister's wedding to be beautiful, just as if it was her own. She was also extremely close to her new brother-in-law. These photos, as Hitler's secretary Christine Schroeder commented, tell it all.
Fegelein
Fegelein used to attend the briefings, but that day he failed to show up. And that was the day Hitler wanted some information from him about Himmler's SS. But Fegelein was nowhere to be found.
SS General Fegelein fled the bunker. He went straight to his own private apartments. "I definitely don't intend to die in Berlin," he said. One last time he called his sister-in-law inside the bunker. "Eva, you got to leave the Führer," he pleaded. "Don't be stupid. This is a matter of life and death." Fegelein knew about Himmler's plans for surrender. He was apprehended by the Führer's escort unit. One of the men was Kurt Larsen.
A special detail was ordered to stop him from escaping. Under no circumstances was he to leave. In other words, kill him. I joined them more or less by coincidence. And indeed, within a few minutes, he tried to escape. And while he was running, he was shot and killed.
Fegelein's wife, Gretel, was pregnant. Eva allegedly begged Hitler to spare her brother-in-law's life. The recently released documents from Moscow also shed new light on the reasons why Fegelein was shot. According to this evidence, it was not Hitler who wanted him dead, but his aide, Otto Günscher. Hitler, in fact, was minded to spare him.
Und gerade dagegen wandte sich Günscher als SS-Offizier
And Günscher, being an SS officer, was vehemently opposed to that. He urged Hitler vociferously to have Fegelein shot, whereas Hitler himself had no particular relation to Fegelein and just wanted to let him escape. That characterizes the situation inside the bunker at the time. Hitler had actually lost control and was waiting with indifference for things to develop.
Teilnahmslos auf den weiteren Gang der Ereignisse harrte.
Although sustaining heavy losses, Soviet divisions fought their way through the ruins of Berlin, building by building, street by street, inexorably closing in on the city center. Inside the bunker, the mood was gloomy and apathetic. Hardly any hope of escaping from the dungeon remained. As a young officer, Ulrich de Maizière had attended 16 briefings in the bunker.
It was relatively calm, and inside the briefing room, Hitler was standing with Bormann and Generals Krebs and Burgdorf in front of a large city map of Berlin, reading reports to each other about the house-to-house combat. They focused on the geographical proximity of the fighting to the bunker. This image of the leading people of the Reich in front of a city map of Berlin seemed symbolic and tangible at the same time, indicative of the collapse of the Reich.
Those who surrendered too quickly were eliminated by SS officers who showed no mercy. And yet, more and more of the troops decided to give up a pointless battle and instead elected to go into captivity. Overriding the fear, there was starvation. In the midst of the chaos of the collapse, hunger had become a matter of life and death. Provisions had long ago run out. Dead horses were frenziedly hacked up for food by ravenous citizens. In such desperate times, who cared anything about Hitler anymore?
Hitler had, by this stage, largely passed out of the view of most of the population, and their interest was taken up completely by matters that concerned them. It's pretty obvious, and for them, Hitler was a symbol simply of the desperate continuation of a long-since-lost war.
Inside the bunker, even within Hitler's immediate entourage, there were signs of moral and psychological disintegration. People sat around listlessly and drank and smoked, just gazing into space like specters. Hitler seemed not to care about anything anymore. There was only one topic of conversation, whispered in hushed tones.
How should they do it? Shoot themselves in the mouth or in the head with a pistol? Or should they swallow the capsule? The bigwigs had a capsule, of course.
The cyanide capsules had been provided by Himmler. Hitler doubted whether they would actually work, so he tested the poison on his beloved German shepherd dog, Blondie. When it came to committing suicide, he needed to be absolutely sure.
The whole situation was so depressing, so fatalistic and so macabre. We were all in deep despair, but we would not show it on the outside. We kept it bottled up inside.
In the bunker underneath the Chancellery, Otto Busser had been joined by his fiancée a few days previously. She had fled from the advancing Red Army to be with Otto in Berlin. Her name was Ingeborg.
Brigitte Bardot, aber noch schöner.
Brigitte Bardot, only more beautiful. Long blonde hair, a delicate person. Otherwise, I wouldn't have married her. I wasn't bad-looking myself.
But did they have a future?
We had this idea, and I said, let's end our lives in dignity. Let's get married.
They decided to end their lives as newlyweds. They would have a wedding ceremony in the ruins of the Chancellery, with all the trimmings, witnesses, a registrar, and VIP guests.
And then came Hitler and Eva Braun. We were standing in a semicircle, and he shook my hand and said the historic phrase, "Either we win here or we die." And someone shouted, "We'll win, my Führer." We all looked at each other, thinking, what an idiot. There was no emotion, and then he went. It was a ruin.
On the 29th of April, the Red Army was only a few hundred meters from the bunker. Berlin's city commandant, General Helmuth Weidling, reckoned that the enemy would reach the Reich Chancellery by the 1st of May at the latest. In Milan, an angry mob had strung up the bodies of Mussolini and his mistress Carla Petacci at a petrol station on the Piazzale Loreto on the 28th of April. Hitler was apprehensive that he might meet a similar fate. He was well aware that the time had come to end the charade, but before he committed suicide, he intended to marry Eva Braun. As long as Hitler had still believed in a future, he had not wanted to tie himself to another person. But now it was time to reward his lover for her unswerving loyalty. Eva was so surprised that she almost signed the document with her maiden name. For Eva Hitler, née Braun, the wedding ring was like an order of merit. This is the actual ring, discovered in the United States.
And then we were all invited to have a glass of champagne. And as I went into the room, Hitler was standing by the door and said, "Come with me." He went into the next room and said, "I want to dictate my last will and testament to you."
Und dann hat gesagt, ich will Ihnen mein Testament diktieren.
Hitler divided his testament into two parts, an extensive political one and a much shorter personal one.
Und dann habe ich gedacht,
At that point, I thought, now I'm going to find out why this war is ending the way it is and why things went the way they did.
But Hitler's will is a document full of pompous self-righteousness and unbridled hatred of the Jews. In it, he claims that he never wanted the war and that others were to blame for starting it. Berlin, the 29th of April 1945, 4 o'clock.
No regrets, no explanations as to why he had not surrendered. The testament was one huge disappointment for me.
At the same time in Dachau, near Munich, the concentration camp there was being liberated by the US Army. It was the oldest of the Nazi concentration camps in Germany. In this hellish place, the liberators saw at first hand Hitler's racist vitriol in all its wickedness. In Dachau alone, more than 30,000 people were murdered. Inside the bunker, there lingered one last irrational glimmer of hope. The 29th of April, 11 p.m., Hitler sent a radio message to find out the whereabouts of Wenck's army.
Ja, der hat bei uns überhaupt keine Wirkung gehabt.
That had absolutely no effect on us.
Der kam halt.
It just came in,
Und,
just like the flyers
genauso
came.
wie Flugblätter kamen.
Where is Wenck?
Wo ist Wenck?
We just
Und all
burned that
diese
message.
ganzen Geschichten, das wurde
There was no
alles
action.
verbrannt. Da ist gar nichts geschehen.
4 hours later, Hitler was informed of the hopelessness of his situation. He then bade farewell to his loyal staff members in the conference hall. The following day, Hitler predicted he would be cursed by millions. The 30th of April, approximately 3:30 a.m. inside the bunker. Hitler and his wife Eva retreated to their living quarters. A short time later, a shot was heard that signaled the end of one of the most evil men of the 20th century. Millions of people had been killed because of Adolf Hitler. The room where Hitler died on the 30th of April 1945 was seen by Arthur Axmann.
Adolf Hitler saß in der rechten Seite des
Adolf
Sofas.
Hitler was sitting on the right side of the sofa.
Oberkörper war leicht zur Seite geneigt. Der Kopf
His upper
etwas
body was slanted slightly to one
nach
side.
hinten gesunken. Stirn und Gesicht waren
And blood was
auffällig
running from his
weiß
head.
und von seiner Schläfe lief ein Blutrinsal herunter.
The Hitler Youth leader, Arthur Axmann, was one of only 3 witnesses who saw Hitler dead and who survived the war. But information about the actual position of the body was contradictory and led to legend and speculation. The SS aide-de-camp, Otto Gunscher, claimed the corpse was not on the sofa but in an armchair and had a wound in the right temple. Hitler's manservant, Heinz Linger, insisted the body was leaning against the left side of the sofa and that there were bloodstains on the right temple. Did Hitler pull the trigger himself? He had said on several occasions, "My hands are shaking so much I can barely hold my pistol. If I was ever wounded, none of my staff would be willing to give me the coup de grace." Did Hitler take the cyanide capsule first before shooting himself?
Hitler wanted to be absolutely certain that he was going to be dead and not end up like some of the generals after the great coup d'etat who had shot themselves in the head but not killed themselves.
Hitler had consulted the SS surgeon Ernst Gunther Schenk for some professional advice.
He only asked what would be the best method, and I replied, hydrogen cyanide. I already knew about the capsules that existed. The Army Medical Service had been ordered to produce them in great quantities since November 1944. I don't know for whom. But when I said that, it was purely theoretical, with no specific purpose.
Did Hitler follow his advice? His last will stated, "I don't wish to fall into the hands of the Russians." Today, there is no longer any doubt that Hitler shot himself. The statements of Linger and Gunscher made in Moscow have answered that question once and for all. The corpses of Adolf and Eva Hitler were cremated in the garden of the Reich Chancellery. Official propaganda claimed it had been a heroic death.
Aus dem Führerhauptquartier wird gemeldet, dass unser Führer Adolf Hitler heute Nachmittag in seinem Befehlsstand in der Reichskanzlei bis zum letzten Atemzuge gegen den Bolschewismus kämpfend für Deutschland gefallen ist.
The war lasted another week, and the slaughter continued. Still alive inside the bunker were Joseph Goebbels and his family. Magda Goebbels was a fervent Nazi, and she had the resolve to take her beliefs to the extreme.
I once talked to her and she said there was no other solution. She did not want the children to suffer after the war. She could not have imagined that any kind of life would be possible for the kids. And she said it was the toughest decision of her life. But she had to go through with it. And she stayed very quiet, and I hardly ever saw her again. She stayed in her room. Maybe it was hard for her to look them in the eyes.
With the help of Hitler's physician, Dr. Ludwig Stumpfegger, Magda drugged her children with morphine and then poisoned them with cyanide. A little later, their parents committed suicide. Soldiers of the Soviet Secret Service discovered the bodies of the family the following day. But they were much more concerned to find out what had happened to the Führer. It took several days to find parts of a corpse and teeth that could be matched to Hitler's without any shadow of a doubt. A year later, at the same location, another discovery was made.
At the location where Hitler's corpse had been dug up a year earlier, the fact-finding committee found parts of the back of a skull with clearly visible traces of an exit wound. On the basis of this evidence, the forensic experts concluded that the trajectory of the gunshot went from the front to the rear and from the bottom to the top of the skull. And that is more or less conclusive evidence that Hitler shot himself.
Back in 1945, chaos ruled in Berlin, and rumors abounded about the fate of the dictator. The discovery of a corpse bearing some resemblance to him attracted newsreel coverage. His death became a political issue that over the years has fascinated countless historians, journalists, and millions of ordinary people.
In this way, there's a fascination with Hitler, and the bunker episode, I think, is one element of this, that here's this really macabre end. It does seem as if you've written a script for it, and it ends up with Götterdämmerung and with this, all going up in flames in the bunker. If you had been trying to write a film, this is how you would have wanted it to end, I presume, a film about Hitler. But this is not film, it's reality, and the reality has to be borne in mind why we're having that. So I still retain the notion that this was, in reality, a shabby, sordid end. But of course, the story that built up to it is one of the greatest importance for the history not just of Germany, but of Europe and the world. And that's why, again, there is worldwide fascination in Hitler, not just national fascination in him.
Most of Hitler's bunker was blown up after the war. The communist regime in East Germany took care of the rest. Today, a residential neighborhood covers the site where Hitler was once cremated, and nearby there stands a memorial to the Holocaust.
A remarkable true story is on Tuesday at 10 here on War 4, where the filmmaker delves into her dangerous dreams of her own death. And next tonight, our World War II season continues with the award-winning Dresden, a film drama reliving the massive bombing of this historic German city.